Do you like playing Call of Cthulhu and want to play something longer than one shot, but you're not quite ready to sink your teeth into Master Tab? Well, I have good news for you today because I'm going to be reviewing a shorter campaign that was recently published on the Miskatonic repository. Nothing is Lost, All is Transformed was written by Charles Mathieu Dumaine, and the overall time for this, my players took about 5 sessions, 4 hours each, so a total of 20 hours. Now, this is, of course, a longer commitment than a normal one-shot, but it's not going to take your players 1 year or 2 years to complete, so I feel like this is a cool happy medium for something a little bit longer. The setting for this is Paris, France in 1937 during an interdisciplinary international scientific congress. Now, the cool thing about this is, one, it was an actual event that happened in 1937, and two, it's basically just a fancy way of saying that there's a lot of different people from a lot of different countries coming to talk sciencey things. One of the scientists that was set to speak at this Congress was found dead. His friend, Tristan Kent, is the one that reaches out to the investigators for help. See, there's these rumors going around that the person who was found dead was a suicidal lunatic. And Tristan does not like that that's going around and would like to figure out what's actually happened and to quell some of these rumors. This leads down a path of navigating Parisian society, opening different options for alliances, and investigating to find that there's something greater at stake. I'll be walking through the key points of this campaign and my top tips for running it. So there's going to be a ton of spoilers moving forward, so be warned. The storyline for this campaign was really intriguing and fun to play. But to understand this storyline, we really have to understand the cult that's brewing underneath. And here's where I get to the first praise of this campaign, which is the Great Old One and the accompanying cult was created by the author. So this is something unique to Mythos lore, which I absolutely adore. In Lovecraftian fashion, the Great Old One has a very difficult name to pronounce, so we're gonna go with Knoth Nog. And the cult that follows this Great Old One is the Overum Nigrum. Now, this cult, way back in the day, they ended up being able to inject 4 eggs with the essence and thoughts of this Great Old One. Now, these eggs are considered relics for the cult and very important to their whole thing. One of the cultists ends up ingesting one of these eggs, and so now there's 3 left. There is a weird thing that happened with him once he ate it, and he started to turn into this weird, monstrous form with eyes on the outside and a giant blob of grossness. And basically the cult started worshiping this cultist as a herald for the Great Old One. Fast forward a little bit to recent times, and the leader of the cult, who is Father Azarius, is realizing that this herald is slowly deteriorating and becoming weaker. So the mission of the cult is to come up with a new herald and to get someone else to transform. The cult leader recruits Marcus, who is a colleague, friend, and scientist, to try and figure out how to create a new herald. Well, this was a little bit of a misstep on the leader's part because Marcus is a scientist at heart and he starts experimenting with these eggs. And it's very intriguing to him, and so he ends up stealing the eggs and is going to plan to flee the country. But before he does, the father understands what's going on and puts a spell on Marcus to kill himself. So while, yes, he did commit suicide, it was not really by his own choice. So that's what happened with Marcus. But before he died, he injected his friend Tristan with some of the egg goo that he learned was very healing. Tristan was suffering from Pompe disease, which is something that is deteriorating the muscles and is a genetic disease. Tristan is now indebted to Marcus and is really motivated to try and get investigators in to help figure out what's going on. So what are the investigators' main goals? First of all, I want to call out that this scenario is not the best at telling the keeper what's going on right away. So you kind of have to read through the entire campaign and slowly learn the different pieces as you go along. My recommendation is to take notes as you go and make sure that you're highlighting these main key points that are going to be important for you to tell your players and have them discover along the way. The campaign will start out with the investigators solving the mystery behind Marcus's murder, but this will lead to uncovering the cult that's behind it. And along the way, they're going to have choices of different alliances, which I'm going to be going into more depth here in a minute. The setting of Paris is really unique and fun to play with, and a great chance to immerse your players into this environment. And part of this comes from explaining the dichotomy of the different neighborhoods in Paris. So there's going to be some opportunities for your players to go to really rich and extravagant parts of town, specifically with Madeline and her mansion, and then some more rundown parts of town or middle working class. And that is going to be on the spectrum of finding the original Marcus's apartment. So being able to explain those different pieces of Paris, and there's a couple really cool guides in the campaign too. The first is page 10, which is advice for the keeper, noting where to add unease and tension during the game. And then page 20 as well, which is surprises of Paris life, where there's lots of places in the campaign to drop things in and spice it up and bring that setting to life. So let's get to the alliances part that I was speaking to earlier. This is a really cool and unique part of this campaign. And I would highly recommend that you make a map of the different options and what these different alliances' goals are, because the scenario doesn't do a great job of kind of organizing that information in an easily referenced way. There will be 4 main organizations, so you're going to want to understand what each of these organizations' goals are and how the investigators are going to stumble upon them and interact with them. And just as a side note, if you are planning to write your own scenario or campaign, I do provide developmental and line editing services, so check out my website below if that's of interest to you. There are 4 main organizations that I'm going to go through their goals. The first is the Ovrum Nigrum, which is the original cult that got Marcus into all this trouble. Their goal is to create a herald, and they need the eggs and Tristan Kent, who already has some of that goo injected into him. So they are going to plan to take Tristan and turn him into the new herald. The next is the Laughing New Moon cult, and this is a false lead, but it is also a competing cult, which was super fun for the scenario to kind of have these 2 cults and the players having to figure out which one was causing the problems and what was going on with both of them. It was just really unique to have 2 cults and some confusion for the players around that. This cult worships Nyarlathotep, and their main goal is just to keep honoring this midnight visitor. Next, we have the Nicolaites, which are scientists, artists, and magicians that have been targeted by the Ovrum Nigrum, and they want revenge. They are also set out to get the Dongsoy Bell, which is an artifact that your players may stumble onto during this campaign. This bell was originally a Russian artifact, but the Nicolaites had access to it at one point and would love to keep it, to keep experimenting on it and figuring out the full story and power of this artifact. And the final organization is the Russian MGB, which is the ancestor to the KGB, which is a network of Russian spies. Marcus came to them promising the egg vaccine in exchange for a fast and safe departure back to Russia. And the Russian MGB also want the Dongsoy Bell, and that's because it was originally a Russian artifact. So there's an extra layer here going on with this that the investigators will have to decide which party to give the bell back to, or if they're just going to keep it themselves. So there's a lot of questions of who do they trust, who caused Marcus's death, who did they give the bell to, who has the correct information. Trying to suss out these 4 different organizations is a key part of this campaign and something that makes it really shine. Let's go into the major NPCs. So the first is Tristan Kent. He is your quest giver, so to speak, and the key part with his transformation is making sure that the players are aware of the deterioration and the different aspects that he goes through as he's transforming into the Herald. So at first he's going to be feeling great because he just got this vaccine and he had previously been suffering from this genetic disease. So although he is distraught that his friend has died, he's also in relatively good spirits. I would require some sort of check-in with your players so that they have an opportunity to come to Tristan with information that they've figured out so far, and they can see these different points happening. After the next time that they see Tristan, he is going to start feeling maybe a little sick, have a really hoarse voice, and feeling not so great. Then the next time, he has a pretty bad itch on his back and he's just not doing well at all. If the investigators go ahead and look at what's happening with Tristan's back, there is a lidless eye back there, which is super creepy and fun. And so that's another chance for your players to really understand there's something wrong here. Eventually, Tristan is going to go into hiding and not let anyone into his house. And he eventually will be taken from the cult and they won't be able to find Tristan. So going through these different steps, encouraging your players to go ahead and check in on Tristan or give him updates will be helpful so they can follow this progression. Also really helpful is the timeline provided in this campaign. So there's an overall timeline for the campaign, and then there is a Tristan timeline for what happens on each of the different dates. So my recommendation is to kind of transfer that Tristan timeline and add it to the main timeline so you have just one thing that you're looking at and referencing as you're playing the game. This should also serve as a bit of a timer and some urgency for the players as they're seeing Tristan slowly deteriorate. Then they know that they need to figure out and solve what's going on. And so I can say that adjusting the type of tension that's going on with this is going to be helpful. So you can use this as a resource to either move the dates up or extend the dates a little bit to match the flow and the rhythm that your players are getting into with this campaign. Next is Father Timothy Azaris, who is the Ovrum Nigrum cult leader, but he is also a priest and a chemistry professor. So that's a little bit of a unique combination, especially for 1937. So really lean into the fact that he is in both of these worlds and the different connections and knowledge that he would have from living in these two different worlds. Next is Madeline, and she is the Laughing New Moon cult leader, and she was also a very close friend of Marcus growing up. She was a lot of fun for me to play and experiment with because she has a unique, warm, welcoming personality, but also quite seductive and good at getting her way. One of the crazy things is she created an orphanage, which on the surface seems like a nice thing to do. However, she uses this orphanage as a recruiting pool for cultists, and those that don't really latch on to the whole cult thing, she just uses as sacrifices. So that is super dark and makes Madeline a pretty multi-layered character to dive into and display to the investigators. So those are the three major NPCs. This campaign did not have a minor NPCs section that laid out a summary of each of those minor NPCs, so I would do that for yourself just as a reference. And what's cool is some of these minor NPCs are real historical figures. So we have Sylvia Beach, who was an actual bookstore owner and was a unique personality for the time frame. And then we also have Fulcanelli, who was pretty cool. No one really knew who his real identity was, but he was a scientist and experimenter as well during that time. So having a little bit of background on those historical figures could help you portray them better for the game. Moving on to the handouts, a lot of them were really cool, but some of them were a little bit hard to read. So it might be worth taking some time to write out what they say so that your players, if they have questions, you'll be able to easily answer them. Let's go through the major locations. The first one I want to talk about is Marcus's apartment. So this apartment is located in a working class area with a lot of different immigrants. So during this time frame, some of the immigrants came from Germany who were Jewish, and then there's some other background that makes it so They struggle sometimes with fitting into society, and in some cases are experiencing discrimination. So that's something that if you're interested in exploring in your game would be a cool opportunity to do that. This is also where they'll meet Dmitri, who is the Russian spy. Dmitri has been looking at Marcus and following him because Marcus has the bell, which is one of their main goals. So there's a lot of different paths that your player can take here. They might run into Dmitri, they might just feel like they're being watched. They might be able to explore Dimitri's apartment, which is below Marcus's. There's a lot of different things here, and feel free to just kind of go with it and work it out as you go with the players. The next major call out I have is around Madeline's home and location, where she throws a lot of parties for the cult. This was my favorite part of the scenario, even though it wasn't technically along the main storyline path. I just ended up having a ton of fun with my players for it, and make sure that you use this as an opportunity to show the dichotomy between Marcus's apartment and Madeline's area, because it is called New Athens and it's beautiful and high class society. This is going to be after the players experience the Polo Club, which is another kind of high society place to interact in. And they might be at the mansion because they're interviewing Madeline, asking her some questions, or they might be there for the Festival of Lights, which is the monthly cult organization party that Madeline runs. There are 3 parts to the Feast of Lights. The first is a drink and mingle situation, and the second is where Madeline brings out a cube, which is an artifact that starts to begin the worshipping of the Midnight Visitor. And this cube has the chance to have a lot of sanity loss for your players. Those who stay awake during this end up being carved and with a knife on their skin, which is going to lead to the next part. But if they fall asleep and get knocked out, then they're invited to leave, as they're not necessarily worthy enough for the third part of the night. I want to tell a quick story. So one of my players chose Gustav as a pre-generated investigator, and Gustav did not have a great time. He took quite a bit of sanity loss here and resulted in getting a phobia. And I promise you can't make this up. I used the chart in the book to figure out what phobia he would come up with, and it was a fear of the moon. So this is the Laughing New Moon cult, and at the time that this party is happening, it is also night outside. So he was in a bit of a bind and struggled, and there was some fun that ensued. Then we get to the third part of this, which is just taking all of those that were marked up to the altar room and finishing up the ceremony. What I love about this is that it's just a casual worshiping of Nyarlathotep. Like, nothing crazy is happening. We're just taking the time, doing our monthly worshiping, and I felt like that was kind of cool, because normally when there's cults involved in scenarios or campaigns, it's this epic ritual, and this is just, nope, we're taking our time. We're just worshiping, doing our monthly thing. So I really enjoyed playing out this party and experiencing that aspect of the cult. The next location is Le Chat Noir. So this is a great place to show the nightlife of Paris. So yet again, another aspect to get your players into the setting and really immerse them in the different aspects of Paris. My main tip here is to make them work to get to see Fulcanelli. So this person is elusive, this person is secretive and don't want a lot of people to be interacting with him. So make them really get creative to be able to have that conversation. Once they finally do, Fulcanelli has this diorama. And the diorama is with the intention of getting revenge on the Ovrum Nigrum. So he wants them to give this as a gift to the Ovrum Nigrum overall cult leader. So this is Father Azaris. And he recommends that they give it to him at the opera. So this is a really cool interaction of the players trying to figure out, who do I trust? What is this gift? And Fulcanelli is very careful about telling them, don't open it, because if they open it, bad things might happen, which he doesn't tell them that, but he just says, don't open the gift, just wait until you give it to the father. So there could be some pretty bad consequences for the players if they do open it early. This is a great time to mention that this campaign is primarily investigation focused. So that means there's not a ton of combat. But I will say that there are opportunities for combat if your group likes to play more in that style. So for the most part, you could go through this campaign without having a single combat. We had something similar. We had one interaction that was a kind of a brawl between some of the cultists and my players. But other than that, we did not have any sort of formal combat, which was totally fine. I thought we had a great time without it. But if your group tends to like more combat, then there are opportunities to add that in. One of which is this area where Fulcanelli, who has previously been marked by the Ovum Nigrum, there are these lackeys from the Great Old One that come, and they're flying creepy things that are going to come and attack Fulcanelli. So it's a chance for your players to get involved in that combat if that's something that they're interested in doing. The next location, Shakespeare and Company, is kind of a side note that your players may or may not go to. But if they do, it is a bookstore, and there's a couple key things that would be important here. First is giving the book that Tristan Kent ordered or his cane back to him. So this is another check-in point, an opportunity for your players to kind of be forced to see where Kent is at in his progression. But it's also really important for the owner, Sylvia, to explain to them that Kent used to have a lot of struggles with medical issues and his disease, and the players will put together that there's something a little bit off about the way that he was immediately better. The other thing you can do is have them do some research here if they're interested in doing that. You can make up a book talking about some of the cult history, which I felt was kind of needed. There was a lot of background for these two cults, the Laughing New Moon and the Ovum Nigrum, but there wasn't a ton of chances for me to give that information to my players. So they ended up doing some research and found a book, and I made up just some quick facts that I thought would be helpful for them. And that helped them kind of get a sense of what was going on and helped them realize that there were two distinct cults. Use Shakespeare and Company as a chance to get your players kind of back on the main storyline, give them a little bit more direction if you think they're feeling a little bit lost. Next is the estate at Labarth, and this is Marcus's secret home where he's doing all these experimentations on the eggs. So your players might end up going there. There could be a multitude of different things that happen depending on the timeline, which is something I really enjoyed about this scenario, is there's lots of different paths, and depending on how your players take time in different places will affect how the remainder of the scenario goes. So in this instance, you might run into the Ovum Nigrum cult who's figured out that there's this alternative location and they're there to steal the eggs back. But you might get there before the cult gets there or after. For me, I thought it was the most fun to have them arrive at the same time. So that's where we had a little bit of interaction, and my investigators did end up getting some of the eggs in their possession. So use this as an opportunity to feel out what your campaign really needs at that time, and rely on the timeline if you're not sure exactly what would be happening when. And I want to bring you back to Gustav's story. So this is the person that unfortunately has a fear of the moon, but during this time he also had some sanity loss, which caused him to get a new mania. And this mania was an obsession with cats, which, if you read this section, it turns out Marcus was doing some experimentation on different small animals, and there was a cat that was buried in the dirt, but his paw was kind of poking up, and it was not a good time for Gustav. He really suffered during this campaign. But that made it a lot of fun, and really it was another aspect of being okay with having your investigators take some sanity loss because it adds spice and flavor to gameplay. At this point, the investigators may or may not have possession of the eggs, the bell artifact, some alliances already made, or maybe they're still trying to figure out who they trust and who they don't trust. But most likely, the final showdown is going to take place either in the underground corridors, which is the lair for the Overnigrum, or they are going to take place at the opera. If the showdown happens in the underground corridors, make sure to use the map provided. This was really helpful to track where the players were going and add some creative encounters if you want to spice it up a little bit. And my tip for the night at the opera is to spend time explaining what's going on stage and having your players envision this horrible scene coming to life, because it's written really well and has some descriptions that would be fun for you to relay to the players. Take your time when planning and reading the different outcomes for this campaign. Since there are a lot of different paths that can be taken, there can be different ways that it resolves. So having that in your head just as a reminder of these are the ways that it could potentially resolve will be helpful as you're guiding players through and figuring out how the story unfolds. That was a lot of information. So here's a quick recap of my overall keeper goals. The first is to make sure that you go through the different alliances and their overall goals. Have that quick reference sheet to help you out. Lean on the descriptions in the campaign because they're really well written and something that is easy for the players to visualize. The imagery specifically of the opera is awesome on page 85. Use some of that as inspiration as you are leading your players through the different locations. And remember to increase the tension with Kent transforming into the new Herald and using those checkpoints to add a little bit of a timer or urgency for your players. Now for my overall thoughts on this campaign. There's a lot of background information and the cult is really well fleshed out, which I thought was incredible. The setting was super interesting and I love the storyline. As I mentioned a couple times, the organization of the document wasn't quite user-friendly when planning for the campaign, so just make sure you are taking notes as you go and making a couple reference sheets that will be helpful for you. The campaign was definitely sandbox, which was nice because I didn't feel like the players were forced into any specific direction. In addition to that, there were lots of paths that the players could take, but they felt like they couldn't do it all, which was nice because they had to make hard choices. Along that line, making the different choices of the alliances that they want to make and navigating Parisian society was really fun and interesting to experience in a game. The link for this campaign will be in my description if you're interested in checking it out. I have more content on Call of Cthulhu over here, and I also do things like Game Master and player advice. So thank you so much for watching. Bye.